welcome back, as you well know. How is everyone?
Hopefully good, as we throw that into the world where we won't get an audio response back.
Yeah.
Welcome to Modern Medieval, the podcast. I'm Megan.
And I'm Ella. And today we're going to speak about a theme, which is kind of a different type of episode, because I feel like we've done subjects, but not a theme. So today's theme is light, given the darkness of December.
Yes, and this is Ella's idea, and we also discussed and decided that we don't know what the other person has brought to the table for this episode. Aside, like, I know Ella will be talking about Dante and light because I just know that that's her background to an extent and like her research. And I bet Ella is expecting me to be coming with some religious or theological medieval things on light. But other than that, we have no idea where we're going to go. So hopefully you enjoy this bountiful illuminated ride. Ella, why don't you get us going?
Of course, that'd be lovely. Okay, so I realized after proposing this that basically this is what I did my dissertation on, kind of. The reason for this theme is because in the UK we've had the time change, and in the UK in winter, if anyone's been or lives here, they'll know that it's basically dark all day long and all night long, because of how, you know, you get up and it's dark and you go to work, you go to school or whatever, or you do your thing, and then like you leave at 5 or 6 and it's dark. And so the contrast of this that came to mind is the idea of, like, somehow in my mind I had like an idea of like churches and a fresky and things like that, and then I thought, oh, I've done something about this, I've done something about light, and so that's where we decided to go on. And as I was preparing for this, I was like, well, I can't do this without talking about Dante, because Dante's Paradise is based on the idea of light. And so for those of you who've read him, you might, you know, have an idea of things that you'd want to listen to, but often Dante's Paradise isn't something that people like to read because it's kind of always the same.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very theological, which is great because Megan's going to give that context. But it's also got like this metaphysical idea that paradise is basically just light, and all images and geometry come into place with an idea that God is illuminating everything. And so the poem's basis of that book is about circling around how light illuminates one person more or less depending on their valor and their importance and what they've accomplished, and that everything's reflection. And so the poem itself does that, which is amazing. But I think that it is something that's kind of difficult to dip into if you're an external reader, because it's got like that sense of theology and like having to have a background, but also it's very difficult to imagine. So when I'd done my dissertation, I had looked at like illustrations of that, because it's quite an interesting complicated idea of like, how do you illustrate the ineffable, and how do you illustrate light, how do you create something that doesn't have definition, that is basically a narrative poem into an image. So that's how I thought of that. And so for you guys, I have a few interesting little things to like read and hopefully get you obsessed on this as much as I am, which maybe is not a good thing, because we were just saying how like sometimes when you really like something, it's kind of difficult because then it's just that all the time. And then you end up hating it. So I really hope that I just convey the nice things about this rather than the bad things. And so without further ado, I'll start with the first canto. I'll just read like a few little bits so that you get an idea. So canto 1, I'll read the Italian and then read the English, and then we can kind of, Megan's great for this, we'll just like jump off like what we see and what we think, and then I'll do a few of these and then like pass it over to Megan, because I think that might be interesting, or we can jump in and discuss and whatever. So it starts like this. La gloria di colui che tutto muove, per l'universo penetra e risplende, in una parte più e meno altrove, which translates, the glory of him who moved everything doth penetrate the universe, and shine in one part more and in another less. So from the off start, light is everywhere. It is what moves the world. It is what dictates the world with what gets more light and what gets less. And so it's quite interesting. The first thing that you read when you jump into this world is this idea of movement, and that light penetrates, which is like a verb that is very much linked to light, and it's quite a strong word. It's something, if penetration, well, that's got quite sexual, but yeah, but it's a strong type of verb. It's not inactive, it's very active. And so I feel like in the illustrations that I've looked at when I was doing this, there's like this very like large amount of light and lightness. And so to me, I just find it very beautiful. And there's also quite a lot of geometry in that, which shows as well a sense of a different type of theology going on as well. And it mixes paganism into this quite Catholic imagery. I don't know if there's anything you'd like to think about relating to this.
Yeah, I mean, in regards to so just a refresher, I haven't read any of the Divine Comedies, so I'm going into this based on what Elo has told me and what we've discussed just when we were working on our dissertations, and the fleeting bits that I've read in the research I've done, because Dante, as we've also mentioned, is just inescapable, especially when considering this. But yeah, so the geometry, and it's a different type of harmony, I guess, is what you were gesturing towards, Elo, that there is, this is a very Euclidean kind of idea, that there's like a sacred geometry that is a harmony in the universe. And that is something that it's ancient. It predates ancient times. There's, very like Neolithic ideas. I actually have in my notes Stonehenge and that type of sacred geometry in regards to the solstices and everything. But we can kind of get to like keep that in mind and build on that later, because I don't want to lose the other threads in this amazing introduction to Paradise. And I also want to return to the idea of penetrates. But first, in Purgatory and Hell, are those kind of like descending orders of light, Elo? Like, what is Hell's illumination like, and what is Purgatory's respectively?
So it's quite different. So in Hell, it's all darkness. It's all darkness and fire, but it's cyclical. So you basically can't move forward or backwards. The way that the souls are allocated to Hell depends on the types of sins that they've committed.
Right.
So the worst types of Hell come from like Canto 5 onwards in the different realms, whereas all types of sins are punished in one or in more than one way. And the idea with that is a time there stops. It never begins and never exists. Whereas when you're going, Purgatory is basically a stairway, kind of like a stairway to heaven. And there's an idea of time, because the idea is that you're moving towards going back up. And so the more you go to the beginning of Purgatory, the souls are trying to escape and trying to move forward and, amend their deeds and try and like understand how to move forward and go to get to heaven. And time there is quite important, because you have to pay off that time in which you're in Purgatory to move up to Paradise.
Right.
So those souls are kind of on their way to being saved. Whereas in Hell, like, there's just no time and it's just pure darkness. So there's a big contrast when you get to heaven, because there's light, but there's no time. And there's no definition of like earthliness, whereas in Purgatory, souls look the way that humans do.
Okay. Yeah, I remember last week when we talked about Buffy and the depiction of heaven in Buffy. Yeah, that was a very Dantean Paradise. That was like your input on that. So the idea of penetration, I'm kind of glad you brought that up, because in medieval study of light, from the bits that I've done, penetration is really important, actually, because theories of light in the Middle Ages were directly related to the science and study of the eyes, and how light comes from and leaves the eyes. For a while, it was believed that our eyes like projected all the light rather than reflected or absorbed it, which I find quite interesting. And this is like, I'm going to try to do this without getting super, it gets really complex in ways that I like don't even really understand, because it is like a really rich field. But just kind of thinking of God as light, right? This is a very Judeo-Christian idea, and how you can't see the angels because they're blinding light and everything. In the book of James, so James 1, or chapter 1, line or verse 17, God is described as the father of lights. And in Psalm 36 of the Old Testament, it reads, "In thy light shall we see light," which I think is really in line with what you've read, Elo, that light begets light, and in such a way that there is no shadow, which, is like the negative space and potentially bad, for lack of a better word. And so this like idea of rays of light penetrating every corner of the universe, but remains with its like singular source, aka God, is discussed with the divine logos, with Christ, and lots of different theologians thought about this, and primary and secondary types of light, accidental light. But one thing, and I'm just going through my notes trying to kind of return, but there are really significant theological texts that kind of discussed this. So one is Peter of Limoges' really significant Tractatus Moralis de Oculo, or a moral treatise on the eye, where, quote, "After the resurrection, we will see heavenly light and therefore God with full directness. But before that, only at an oblique angle to that directness." So this idea that the ineffable God, you cannot see it until you have officially transcended or ascended. Everything's like an angular refraction, which still encapsulates the holy and divine. I mean, so mystics and everyone, what they're seeing is this refraction or this angular idea, but that's not a mutilation of the holy. It's just, it's too much for you to see everything. So that's quite like powerful. Roger Bacon, not the artist, but this is Roger Bacon circa 1214 to 1292, so 13th century, different Roger Bacon. Says, quote, "The whole truth of things in the world, because nothing is fully intelligible unless it is presented before our eyes," in discussing this oblique angle. And we also have John Scotus of Erigena, who was a 9th century theologian, and his De Divisione Naturae, or the division of nature, says, quote, "In my judgment, there is nothing among visible and corporeal things which does not signify something incorporeal and intelligible." So the eyes were understood throughout the Middle Ages to be a sense adapted for understanding God. And we also have Thomas Aquinas, another name that you just can't escape. And
without.
Summa Theologica, using the term visio to not only mean vision, but also apprehension. And the idea that knowing is a visual process. And that's really important. And I think that this kind of links to Dante and the whole story, like to experience paradise, purgatory, and hell, it has to be seen to be understood, and then the other senses come into articulation with that. But in the Middle Ages, it was sight that, from today's perspective, problematically, because, it can exclude blind people and people with visionary, because glasses weren't really a thing and such. But it's kind of like to see it is to believe it, which is quite, I think it's an interesting argument considering that God and the sacred or holy is ineffable by definition.
Yeah, I was just going to say, for those of you who are listening to this and thinking, oh, this is really interesting, but this isn't really my thing. I think that what makes this a very modern thing to talk about is that if you think about all art that has been made, the idea of lightness parades, like it is part of how we think of the world. And in films and in the expressions that we use, this kind of idea of light as having a significance in how we understand the world and how we see good versus bad is there. So whilst having a very medieval root to it, I think it has a very modern understanding.
Yeah, I mean, harking all the way back to, one of our first episodes when Janina came on and we were talking about Sleeping Beauty, Disney's Sleeping Beauty, and how, Maleficent and everything that's all dark colors and greens and purples, and then, of course, blacks and grays. And then you have Aurora, who's golden and light and colorful. Or I'm thinking of like Bruce Almighty or any kind of movie or television show where there's a moment of epiphany or discovery. It's like light cascading down onto you, warming you, filling you. And you think of like even yin and yang, right? To bring in Eastern Asian philosophy, like the light is good and the black is quote unquote bad, but they exist in harmony with one another. Like, yeah, it's all connected, if you will.
Yeah. So to continue on,
yes.
So as we're traveling through heaven, so when we're traveling through purgatory and through hell, as we've intimated, you're traveling in the underworld and then stairs and going up. Whereas when you're traveling in heaven, the experience is so superb that you travel through planets. So there you have like that kind of medievalness of it, like this understanding of what's it called, astrology and things. And the more you travel through them, the more the experience becomes intense. And so this poem is also the poem of loss of words, because the experience is so out of this world that the words that you will cast on recounting the story aren't enough. And so this tension that is there from the very beginning creates very poetic poetry, but it allows your mind to kind of imagine what is happening and how it's supposed to look, because you get to the end of the poem where the poet or the narrative voice just loses all you lose all confidence in it, because you can't trust that like the words that they say themselves, like the words that they are saying don't have any value, because the experience of it is so above and beyond that you just wouldn't be able to imagine it. So another passage I thought was very cool and in theme with lightness is Canto 14, where Dante is with Beatrice in the heaven of the sun, and he meets Solomon. But I'm just going to keep to the lightness. And so the passage is: Diteli se la luce onde si infiora vostra sostanza rimarrà con voi eternalmente siccome egli è ora, ed è ecco intorno di chiarezza pari nascere un lustro sopra quel che verrà, per guisa d'orizzonte che rischiari. Ben m'accorsi io ch'io era più levato per l'affocato riso della stella che mi parera più roggio che l'usato. The translation to that is, and if it do remain, say in what manner, and after ye are again made visible, it can be that it injure not your sight, as by a greater gladness urged and drawn, they who are dancing in a ring sometimes uplift their voices and their motions quicken. So as that arising devout imprompt, the holy circles a new joy displayed in the revolving and the wondrous song. It's quite interesting how like the idea of traveling in this world and like seeing where your soul is going and the lightness that goes in that, I thought it's just quite like a beautiful passage, especially because in modern times we see the sun as being the center of lightness, and it no longer has that kind of mystical, maybe it does, I don't know, it does maybe no longer has this mystical understanding of what light can do and what light brings, but it has the idea that it warms our planet and it brings lightness to life, and I just thought it was quite in theme with this.
Yeah. And I mean, this idea that language, that this experience has gone beyond language, that language falls flat, is kind of almost a postmodern idea, of very like language fractures and splinters and kind of disintegrates because it can't encompass or relate to. There is no like sign that evokes this, if you want to go into semiotics and everything. And yeah, like the idea of movement and spinning is interesting because there's this like force within that. But I guess I'll respond most specifically to this, at the end, your kind of commentary on it of the power of the sun and like how we think of it today. And yeah, it's kind of just there, and we celebrate or acknowledge on our calendars, the solstices and full moons. Your calendar will say it's a full moon, it's a waxing moon, it's a waning moon, it's a new moon, but like that's kind of just lost. It's not always something that is a part of life the way that it was pre, I would argue, I guess, industrial times, because we have electricity. Like light is at our fingertips. It's something that we
take for granted.
Yeah. Because, the argument might be, oh, well, they had candles and fires and everything in the Middle Ages and before. And like, yes, that's true. But that takes a lot of candles for these large open spaces. And a candle or a fireplace can only give off so much light. It also gives off heat. And how much wood do you have, or how much fat or tallow do you have to make the candle? You have to be economical in the way that you're using these resources in a way that is alien to the modern population, I'd argue. But yeah, kind of just like returning, I guess, to Stonehenge, right? This is, again, pre-medieval, but I think is just such a graspable, like everyone knows something about Stonehenge, right? And this stone circle was built to align with the sun, and most specifically the winter and summer solstices, in a way that the sacred geometry that we were discussing earlier is a practical geometry, and that this precise location was chosen in ways that we still don't quite understand, though there are archaeological and geological studies that the glacial paths that go past Stonehenge run on the specific solstice like lines, like in a way. But on the solstices, the sun and or moon go directly through the center of this stone circle. And like there was a lot of care and deliberation, and the stones all have fancy names, but they're like station stones that make a perfect rectangle around the stones. There's the heel stone, which is the one that is the first contact with the sun. So this idea of the power of aligning the celestial sphere, the universe, with the earthly terrain or sphere is something that I think is really powerful. And even medieval churches and stuff were aligned. Generally we think, okay, they usually have it where the altar is like east facing, so that when the sun rises, it first touches the altar, it illuminates. So the idea of like, let there be light, the coming of Christ and everything like that. And so you have just that basic relationship. But then you also have other churches. Like I read this article that was quite interesting from author Alice Isabella Sullivan about the power of sunlight in medieval churches. In this case example, in what used to be Moldavia and now Romania, the church name I don't speak Romanian, but it's the Church of the Holy Cross at Petrauti Monastery in Romania. But there are a lot of incidental accents on that word, so I apologize to any of our listeners that speak Romanian or know the proper pronunciation of that word. But this church is a case example of the sun hitting at certain times of the day on certain days of the year, statues or paintings in the church that then illuminate with the natural light of the sun images of saints, of Christ, of the Eucharist. And so again, this idea of the sun being powerful, and it's the closest, I guess, in it that we can get to God, like in our existence of like harnessing it, and I just think there's something really beautiful in that. And so yeah, that was like a little bit of my 2 bits on that. And Ella, when you said that they were like, dancing hand in hand in a circle, each element, right? So paradise, not heaven, but paradise, purgatory, and hell, they are each constructed in rings, correct? Yeah. So yeah, I guess it's also continuing with that geometry. It'd be interesting if like hell was angular and sharp and harsh and had shadows, and then heaven was circular.
I think it does it is kind of like that. But they're called circles, the circle of this, the circle of that. But it's the way that most people imagine it is kind of like kind of like a triangle, like going from the depths going upwards, and it's supposed to be like below the earth. Mm-hmm. So kind of like a crest. I'm guessing that's how he got his imagination toward that, because like the idea of like the warmer it is, the more hellish it is, and the more dirty and pungent and stuff it is.
Yeah, I really just need to read the Divine Comedy, but
I think you would have a great time. I feel like it is like right down your alley.
Yeah, I'll get there eventually.
You will. You just have to. I think it has to be your moment.
Yeah.
It's one of those books you can push.
Totally. So, Ella, do you have any other?
Yeah, I just wanted to finish with the final bit. Okay. So Canto 33. And this is where Dante has, in the previous cantos, he's now no longer in circles. He's basically arrived. He's in the Imperium, which is just pure light. And this is where you can't trust him anymore. It's the last 3 cantos or so. And he meets the Virgin Mary, and like he has all of these like ecstatic experiences. Mm-hmm. And the poem finishes with him seeing the resurrection of Christ, him seeing all of these things that, are very much part of our culture. But the poem ends with this final verse, which I'll just read, which is L'amor che muove il sole e l'altre stelle, which translates to the love which moves the sun and other stars. And obviously it has a very Catholic or Christian undertone to it, love, the love of God, that is like the love that has created the world. But it has also this idea that the refraction of light becomes a sentiment, and that sentiment we can carry around and we can experience. It was also a very Christian way of thinking of, being alive. But I thought it's a very poetic verse, and it's got this idea of light and stars, and it's in theme, so I thought I'd read it out.
Yeah, I mean, and I do think that it's just a beautiful idea. That is something like just that all is love. And that's a very, I believe it's Julian of Norwich and her Revelations of Divine Love, which came out in 1395, that religion, that God and experience is love. And I do thank you for sharing that, Ella, because that is like a very beautiful passage that it's all encompassing. And so it's interesting that you stated that, at this point, you can't really trust the words that Dante's using, but it's also so like profound and beautiful. So there's kind of like a double-edgedness to it. And I also think it's just interesting that, Dante was able to experience all of this and then write it, or, then like write it down in the poem, because going along a lot of like theological ideas, it was like improper to see the earthly realm following such divine light experiences. Like there is Peter of Limoges in his treatise gives a warning tale of a cleric who sacrifices his eyes to see the Virgin, and then he's blind afterwards because earth becomes like a type of hell. It's too sharp and ugly and brutal following that.
I mean, I don't really know the intention behind Dante's writing of this. The Inferno is what like moved him. The reason that he wrote this is because he got exiled from Florence because of like the terrible corruption that there was at the time, which is an ongoing theme since forever. But like, it is true. I think you're right. Like, it takes quite a lot of guts to write about paradise in that time, especially.
Yeah, it's funny because it's such a theme, right? You have other, particularly women mystics, do the type of religious experience. I mean, if anyone wants to read about that, I highly recommend Caroline Walker Binham's influential text, Holy Feast, Holy Fast. And it's about specifically women and their experiences of faith, because it's very different than men. And part of it's just due to the way that society was and the way you're allowed to express yourself. But also a lot of the medieval female mystics use light and these kind of emotional experiences to express their love and the divine. So, I already mentioned Julian Norwich. Perhaps the most famous in regards to our theme of light would be Hildegard von Bingen, who was a late 11th. She was born in 1098, so very end of the 11th century. So a 12th century mystic. And she wrote letters, had visions, prophecies. She wrote music. She's considered the first kind of author of modern, or not modern, but like the music she composed is still performed today. Like, that's how big of a deal her music was. And that her idea in her Civias book was that was written in 1151, 1152, and it's her recollection of her visions, illustrates divine revelation and manifestation as, quote, "Then I saw a most splendid light, and in the light, the whole of which burnt in a most beautiful shining fire, was the fire of a man of the sapphire color. And that most splendid light poured over the whole of that shining fire, and the shining fire over all that splendid light, and that most splendid light and shining fire over the whole figure of the man, appearing one light and one virtue and power. And again, I heard that living light saying to me, this is the meaning of the mysteries of God, that it may be discerned and understood discreetly what that fullness may be, which is without beginning and to which nothing is wanting, who by the most powerful strength plated all the strong places." And that's book 2 of the Civias. So there's an echo here with Dante, the idea of like light and virtue. As you said, and I do kind of know this a little bit, the paradise spheres are each based on the different virtues that you experience in life. So you have a sphere that's like the warriors of God in Christ.
That's Canto 14:15.
Okay. Yeah.
And actually, there's a little fun tidbit. Dante put one of his ancestors in that bit, so like to show the valor of his name. So it's kind of funny, yeah.
Cheeky. So yeah, just something in that, and like light and power is just really beautiful. And I don't really know else much more like to say, but it is like light is a theme throughout the Middle Ages. And it's not because it was a dark ages. I want to like re-articulate that. Yes, it was perhaps darker than what we have today, because as I was saying earlier, there was like limited illuminating resources. But they definitely had these huge fireplaces, rushlights, torches, lanterns, candles, like there was still a lot of light. It's a different type. And I think that there's almost something more beautiful in the medieval sense of light because they're in tune with the earth. Kind of going back to the beginning where today here in England, it's getting dark at 4 p.m., 4:30 p.m. Just imagine if we didn't have electricity and, you have to use firelight and candlelight to illuminate the home. There is like a warmth to that and a comfort. So it feels also just kind of directly related to the warmth and love of God or the divine or the supreme, whatnot. And it's also like a very, we think today like lighting is about mood and atmosphere and how you light candles for like sexy time and stuff, and just kind of maybe sexy. Thinking but just thinking like, well, why candles at that moment? And then kind of reflect on what we've been talking about. Not saying it has to be take what you will about sexy time being like a sacred experience, that flitters about a lot. And again, this isn't just medieval. Think about the caves of Lascaux, right? With the paintings there, which were meant to be experienced by firelight because it evoked the sense of moving due to the flickering of the flame.
Or Rothko, his massive paintings, I mean, you don't have to know much about art to know about Rothko because he's got like, those paintings of like red, or like all those different colors. They are supposed to be a representation of like divine energy and light. So it's quite interesting in like those kind of dark paintings. You can see that, and he had churches with all his paintings and stuff.
Yeah, very cool. In Texas, and I really want to go. But there's a very theological reading or religious mystical reading of Rothko because of like the depths in these colors and how moving they are. Again, that emotional aspect and the different angles, the different light and the way that the light interacts with the canvas is, it's a great example of this kind of medieval to modern experience, right? Think about painted image on a church wall, right? And the sunlight moving and it's illuminating certain aspects, and then go to like a Rothko painting and the same kind of moving experience. I think that's like a beautiful connection. And I mean, we've basically covered everything that I had notes wise too. The last thing that I wanted to bring in is a book by Cambridge scholar Seb Falk. I haven't read it yet, it's on my list, but this is kind of just like a final throwaway comment, but it's called The Light Ages, The Surprising Story of Medieval Science. So the story takes place in the 14th century. So we're talking about late Middle Ages. And it follows a monk named John of Westwick, which, if I recall, was a real figure, because I discovered this book through the medievalists.net podcast months ago when Seb Falk guested and Danielle Cebulski interviewed him. But the book talks about like science and the illumination of science, and how we think that the Enlightenment, literally, like if we're talking about light cascading on knowing, right, is a very end of Renaissance, beginning of what's considered the Enlightenment era, phase of scientific discovery. So Newton and stuff. But Falk's book is beautiful because it goes, again, the Middle Ages weren't this like dark, dirty time. Like a lot, like astrolabes and different types of science were being discovered that were foundational and essential to the later enlightening, if you will. And so if this is something that interests you, you should look at it further. And like the cover of it's like the US Canada book is of spheres, like the holy spheres, not just from the Divine Comedy, but I believe it's not the Scala Naturae, it's not the Great Chain of Being. It's I can't recall. It might be like the Corporis Divina or something, but the spheres of the heavens in medieval scientific imagination. So just kind of an interesting, I thought, like tie in to what we've been discussing.
Yeah. I've really enjoyed this. I hope you guys have too. Please let us know what you've thought of this kind of episode. And if you want to have your save always, please come and do.
Yes, please. And I'm all light talked out. I don't know about you, Elo.
No, me too. Well, a very good conclusion.
Yes, I agree. Let's tell our audience where they can find us.
So if you've liked this episode and want to listen to our large repertoire, please know that you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Audible, Amazon, wherever you listen to your podcasts, really. We're also on social media if you'd like to interact with us. We've got an email account, modern.medieval.podcast@gmail.com. We are on social media. You can find us on Instagram. Our handle is podcast.modern.medieval. You can find us on Facebook. We've got both a group and a page. It's Modern Medieval Podcast. And finally, we've got a Twitter account, which Megan is the queen of.
You can find us on Twitter under the handle @medieval_modern. And please, on any of our platforms, reach out to us. Our Facebook pages and groups are quite dry and sad because I tend to forget that they exist. So please, message us there, post there, share there. Let's try to make a community. And just thank you so much for making this little project that Elo and I do so enjoyable. We really appreciate and are constantly humbled that people take time out of their day to listen to us ramble about medieval and modern stuff. So until next time, I'm Megan.
And I'm Elo, and this is Modern Medieval, the podcast.